Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
In these videos, one of the things we've talked about on and off here and there is the difference between the initial Alexander technique as you teach it and the modern Alexander technique as it's done through START and the other organization. So one of the debates in this is that you've brought up is the relationship between Alexander and François Delsarte, and how much or to what extent he was influenced by Delsarte, and to what extent the Alexander technique itself is related to the Delsarte. Uh, so, can you talk a little bit about that, about your understanding of where Alexander learned his technique from,
Yes, yes.
and what the future of it is?
Yeah, there is a good occasion because this week I've been requested by one of my former students to give a straight answer. So that's what she's written. I'm going to show you part of her address to me, and she asked, "Do you think the initial Alexander technique is a newborn, or do you see Delsarte as part of the initial Alexander technique that I teach?" And I thought it's first of all, it's a good question. It's always interesting to disclose the genealogy of your teaching. So in my case, for example, I have to explain that yes, I have read a few papers about Delsarte, a few books. I read, well, of course, everything I could find about it. When I discovered that Alexander had certainly some contact with the Delsarte world, because it was so prominent in his time. I mean, his time in 1896, the date when he opened his first teaching practice. So let's go. I'm going to try and share my screen. Apparently it's working. So do you still see Delsarte as part of your initial Alexander technique? And that person says, I'm now thinking perhaps that the Delsarte element was certainly what FM was teaching early on, along with his natural elocution. It fits with combining natural breathing and working with theater. But that the pools you define probably come more from the procedures such as hands on the back of a chair, going on the toes from 1908 on, as they are where the opposition are in practical work. And she says, I've been reading a lot more Delsarte stuff and don't feel there is any evidence of strong pulls, but are there? To me, it looks more like body mapping. So I prepared an answer to that question. I think it's a valid question. And to prepare the answer, I just took a few quotes and I answered. So I thought it could be a good thing that I answer in public using the same quotes. And so the first quote is from Walter Carrington. Walter Carrington is one of the leading teacher of the modern Alexander technique. I had lessons with him. He was a great gentleman, great man. And he had an interview that was published in a book in 2001 where he acknowledges that Alexander certainly had contact with, well, the Delsarte mania, the Delsarte craze. He said, so that's what Walter Carrington is saying. Delsarte made a study of gesture, what nowadays we would call body language, and he created a system for teaching actors. This is absolutely correct. Then Walter says, I remember that FM used to illustrate that a pickpocket or a sneak thief who hunted to draw the attention of one of his accomplices would beckon like this by wiggling the little finger. So are we to understand that wiggling the little finger is a gesture that was taught in the Delsarte system? I don't know. It seems unrelated to me. But the conclusion is quite interesting. So FM, that stands for Frederick Matthias Alexander. So FM had certainly studied the Delsarte system, And in the early days, it was one of the things that he taught. It's also clear from what I have been able to find out that Delsarte had some rudimentary ideas about the use of the body. This would naturally interest FM, who was fascinated with anything to do with use. So when you read something like that, you hear, well, the tone, yeah. In the early days, it was one of the things that FM Alexander taught, among other things, which he abandoned later. And so Delsarte had some rudimentary ideas about the use of the body. This is all a bit deprecatory, in my opinion. But, well, it seems that the big wigs of the modern Alexander technique are saying, and they are repeating the same thing nowadays, it seems that yes, Alexander certainly had contact with the Delsartism. There were so many books in the 1890s that it seems almost impossible that he missed them. And second, after a while, Alexander discovered his own technique and started to put hands-on, which, well, it's absolutely clear that Delsarte never encouraged or never did himself. So the Alexander technique and the Delsarte system are totally apart. That's the idea. So my position is, of course, totally different. What I said 10 years ago when I had a few contacts with Penelope Easton and what I say today is exactly the same thing. I have not changed my views. The initial Alexander technique is full of ideas coming from the Delsarte system. So I have taken a few examples of what Alexander could have read. For example, we have a very interesting small book. It's called the Delsartean Scrapbook. It was published by Russell in 1890s, which is quite an early date. And he said that the object of the work of Delsarte is not to teach a special set of gesture or an arbitrary code of manners, but to train the whole body until it is an instrument of facile and natural expression. Delsarte always insisted that the physical part of his training should precede the philosophical, and as the gymnastic are mainly for the correction of personal deviation from nature, they should never be printed as a series of rules to be applied to all. There are two things of great interest in the Russell statement. We will see that Delsarte studied gestures and created a system for studying gestures. Gestures in our Alexander technique jargon are whole body movements. How do you stand? How do you go from sitting to standing or standing to sitting? How do you breathe? Is not considered special acts that are that can be isolated and segregated. It's not possible for Delsarte, and I think it's the same for Alexander, to separate, for example, the breathing function, which happen in the rib cage, from the postural response. Because for Alexander, for example, the rib cage is first of all used for postural purposes. Alexander considered that breathing is a secondary, if not a tertiary part of function of the rib cage and spine. So why is it that Russell says that the object of the work is not to teach a special set of gestures? Well, that is because Delsarte wanted the actor, because it was a training of actor, he wanted the actor to become a master of himself. That is, that instead of just repeating sequence of movement that were familiar to the actor, he wanted the actor to consciously control the production of gestures. So the idea was not to teach a set of gestures. For example, the gesture of bending, or the gesture of presenting the hands in front of oneself, like reaching for something that is not there. That's what an actor would do, for example. The idea was to coordinate the movements of the different parts of the mechanism into a natural expression. And when we say natural expression, Delsarte does not mean something that is natural. No, it means something that looks natural to the public. It should not feel natural. It will never feel natural to produce gestures that are different from the repeated coordination of movement that we feel easy, that we feel natural. The second point is that there is a physical part in the training of Delsarte. This is a difficult position that Russell is taking here, because Delsarte did not make that much difference between the mental and the physical, and for him it was clear that the mind should use the body as his instrument, or her instrument, if you want. And where the point is interesting is that the Delsarte system looked at the limitations of movements in the actor presence, in the actor way of sitting, standing, of moving, walking, etc. And the point of the Delsarte system is that it was to correct defects and limitations of movements. So there is no general, you should do this and that, and this is going to be fine. You should have the head leading, and the body will follow, and everything will be good. Delsarte really believed in the coordinations of movements. He saw that gestures were made of a number of movements. And when we discuss defects, we are discussing defects of coordination. That's the central aspect of the Delsarte system. So this is Emily Bishop, 1892, talking relatively of the same thing. And she says there is no Delsarte walk, no Delsarte standing position, no Delsarte way to sit down, no Delsarte way to go up on the toes or to do anything. The only way Delsarte thought is nature's way. Man can no more make natural things than he can create truth. He can create unnatural ways and falsehoods. At best, he can discover nature's way and live and express correctly the truth. Again, this can be understood completely in the opposite direction. Because when you are talking about nature's way, it's as if the human being is a natural animal that has learned wrong habits from his schooling, from his, copying other people, and from his culture. But that's not Delsarte's idea. Delsarte is completely opposite, and he thinks that it's through the use of the mind, through the use of reasoning, through the use of analysis, that we can sort of start to understand the movements that are making the gestures. So to bow to nature is to find the law, and is to obey the law. It's not to, accept what you feel as true and just reproduce what you feel is right. This has never been the Delsarte way, and it has never been mine either. So you can still understand from these words that we are going to discuss walking. we are going to discuss the standing position. We are going to discuss the way to sit down, to stand up, the way to bring the hands on top of the rail of the chair. We are going to discuss how to fall against the wall, which are all these things are Delsarte's exercises. And these Delsarte exercises, you will find them in Alexander's books. Alexander did not invent the work with the chair. He did not invent hands on the back of a chair. He didn't create this idea of going up on the toes after 1908. No way. This existed prior to him, prior to his birth. There are books where you see people going up on the toes. There are books where you see people going from sitting to standing with clear rules. So, yeah, there is no Delsarte walk, but it's certain that Delsarte was teaching balance and poise in walking. So, I'm still teaching walk. I'm teaching the standing position. I'm still teaching going up from the chair without throwing the middle torso forward, which is what Alexander in his books called, of course, the frog dance. I am still teaching that. I did not invent any of these things, of course. I started to study them through Alexander's writing, but as I could not make much sense of what he was explaining, because of my own difficulties, but also because Alexander is very scarce about his indication, I had to find others' indication, and I found them many in the Delsartean books, or even in Delsarte, because we have the translation now of the Delsarte lessons that are written. And so, what is central to Delsarte is the concept of dynamic harmony. So it's very important to understand that the initial Alexander technique draws its root, its center from there. So what Delsarte is saying is that all there is to make the parts harmonic between themselves is to put the levers into play in opposition and to realize in this way poise, as anything is harmonious when it is in equilibrium. Well. So here we discover that Delsarte is talking about the physics. He's talking about the concrete aspect of creating a gesture. And he sees beyond the first impression. You have the impression that the person is sitting properly or not properly, that the person is using the voice. The voice may sound, well, in some ways disagreeable, or in some ways incorrect, or the posture seems a bit tense or a bit rigid, and you can make a judgment. This is not the kind of observation that Delsarte has created, and I do not observe how my pupils or students are behaving with these kinds of impressions. It's not at all the Delsarte way. The Delsarte way is to consider that we are discussing a mechanism. There is a mechanical reality behind the way I sit, behind the way I will stand, and that mechanical reality is that there are bony parts, which very often we will call lever, and these levers are rotating around joints that connects levers together, and these levers are also connected with tissues, most of them being elastic tissues. So in the Delsarte system, there is this idea that gestures are made of movements of levers, that the movement of these levers are going to create or not some tensions in the tissue surrounding them. And the idea of Delsarte is the central concept of dynamic harmony is opposition of movements. If you realize an opposition of movement, we will see how it works, you will realize in this way poise. It's what you would call a new equilibrium. There is different ways you can try to maintain your posture and stabilize yourself. You have this idea of stability that is foremost in your mind. Poise is just the exact opposite. Poise is made of movements, and so you move different parts in different directions. So everything is based on movements. And I do continue that same idea in my lessons. And we can describe these movements. As soon as we can describe these movements, we can describe which movements are expanding the torso, lengthening the spine, and which movements are not. Therefore, we can start to analyze where in the gesture the person is creating wrong coordination of movements of the different levers. That's the basic Delsarte center. And so for Delsarte, there is a grammar of gestures. There is this possibility to describe different action with words and a special language, of course. We will see the language of geometry. It's necessary to use a language that is appropriate to the end we are seeking, which is the dynamic harmony of the whole. And so for him, the notion of learning verbal orders is central. This is, for me, what I call conscious guidance. Yeah. Well, once in a while, I can still use Alexander's writing. This is in Conscious Drift, Conscious Control of the Individual, FM Alexander's second book. And he says, in fact, it will be found that as a rule, a pupil has no conception of linking up the different parts of the movement and the orders relating to these. To me, that sentence seems coming from Delsarte. It seems coming from a book of the Delsarte system, not from the Alexander technique, the modern Alexander technique, linking up the different parts of the movement. I wonder for my colleagues of the modern Alexander technique what that would mean. And orders relating to different parts of the movement? Well, I would make one change in that sentence to make it really Destartian. I would say that it will be found as a rule, a pupil has no conception of linking up the different parts of a gesture and the orders relating to these. That's the only change I would make, so that it's easier to understand. Yeah. For Delsarte, a movement is a movement of a lever, and you need a number of movement of levers to make a gesture with the whole anatomical structure. So I do consider that this is what I teach. So nowadays I still think, like I did 10 years ago, that the Delsarte system is still the very core, the foundation, and also, if you want, the arsenal of tools that I use as teacher of the initial Alexander technique. And as many modern Alexander technique are saying, I tend to agree with them that I am not teaching the Alexander technique as they know it. That's absolutely clear. Yeah. The orders relating to the different part of a gesture. I never heard of that during my training as a modern Alexander teacher. So it's always necessary to take a perspective on this concept of dynamic harmony. And the perspective is shown here by one of the great disseminator of the Delsarte system, which is Mackay, that introduced the Delsarte system in the States. So this is from his paper in 1888. the harmonic poise, or that poise of the body upon its feet, which bring all its different parts into the best relation for a subtle precision of harmonic cooperation. We have here something that will become, well, quite common for us. It's that the use of the body as not the body as a whole, but as the torso. The body is the central part. The body for Delsarte is the center of gesture. The center of gesture is not the head or the neck and head. For Delsarte, the center from which everything radiates means moving in rotation, is the torso, what we call the torso here in the initial Alexander technique. And so the aim of Delsarte was to bring all the different parts in the best relation for a subtle precision of harmonic cooperation that is called poise, that is basically equilibrium. Equilibrium without any sort of use of shortening muscles, of in fact compressing joints. Imagine a different way to direct the mechanism, or he didn't imagine, he found a different way. And so that is obtained through work. The conscious guidance and control part is there. What is Giraudet is a French artist, French actor and singer that wrote a very interesting book in 1895, which is called Mimic, Physionomie et Geste, d'après le système de François Delsarte. Pantomimic activity, physiognomy, and gestural construction is what the Delsarte system is about. How to appear to be afraid, how to appear to be eager or tired on stage. That in order for that to happen with the quality of naturalness that is going to be interpreted by the public as something natural, is not to become really immersed into the feelings of the person that the actor wants to represent. No, it's to it's not to improvise. I would call it improvisation. You know, if you want to appear safe and balanced and organized, you could have these ideas in mind and just improvise and try to look in this way. If you want to attain poise, think of poise. Think that you impersonate poise. This is totally incongruous. It does not correspond at all with Delsarte idea. Delsarte wanted the reasoned way to produce gestures with mathematical precision. So that's why Giraudet translate this in saying the pantomimic artist cannot be an improviser. Dramatic art is an art of reflection, observation, research, analysis, the synthesis of which is reflected in its greater power through expression. Many people will ask themselves, what has this to do with the Alexander technique? We are not teaching actors. No, we are not. But it's obvious that the individual, the human beings that are coming to have lessons with me, they come with very interesting limitations of movements. They tend to repeat time and again the same organization of movements of the different parts of the torso. And they have no idea that they are doing such a things with the different parts of the torso. And so when they suddenly discover, it's very simple. I just ask them to perform an action and I film and I then explain what I see on film. And then I can take different actions. I ask them to perform for the camera different gestures. Reach forward with the hands, sit down, take a few steps, take a step back, go up on the toes, go away from the wall, if the person is leaning from the wall, and then I can explain to the person and showing concretely that the person is clearly organizing different movements, and these different movements create a gesture. That gesture, being more or less solidified by the repetition, becomes a posture, and we see a certain posture. Behind the posture there is the gesture, behind the gesture there are the movements. And I can start to describe the movements. And I'm not asking the person to improvise. If you feel free, you're going to be free. This is improvisation. Yeah. If you feel that you're at ease, if you find a way somewhere in your body that you're at ease, you're going to be capable of improvising ease. This is the opposite of conscious guidance. Improvisation is not that. Improvisation is not the Delsarte system, and it's certainly not the Alexander technique, as I see it, of course. I cannot say that I have more than 2 students that are dramatic actors. So, what is the point of teaching this to someone else? Well, it's very simple. Once anybody has discovered that, yes, they have some habits of coordination of different movements that make their gesture and their position, it's possible then for them to try and reflect about it, to observe what's happening, to research, whether researching means just asking questions. So we see that every time you're performing a gesture, you're doing certain movements with the different parts of the torso, which shorten the stature, protrude the abdomen, unduly lift the front part of the chest. So the research is, could it be possible not to do that? Could it be possible to refuse to do the wrong movements, the wrong thing that are leading to the gesture and your habitual posture? I'm not even selling some benefits. It's not my profession. I am not there to say to people, you will see, you're going to be cured. It's going to be easy and you will feel completely different. No. I do not sell cures. I sell analysis and, of course, synthesis. So what do we mean by synthesis? Once you have reflected on the different movements you're making, once you have observed on video that these gestures are really habitual and they are beyond your will to start with, well then you research and you ask yourself, is that possible or not, to not do this? Then you discover that you have to use your mind to organize different intentions of movement at the same time, because these different levers, they move at the same time. So you will see that our gestures, here it's like a poetic narration by Brown. Brown, 1886, also 10 years before Alexander started to teach. So our gestures outline form, describe line, trace segments of circle, and apply all the elements of geometry to the spaces about us. Of course, you must understand that this could be true of subconscious or subconsciously guided gestures, things you do without knowing it. Yes, but that's not what Brown is talking about. Brown is talking about using a definite language in order to create a pantomimic representation. You want to represent what it is to expand the torso. If you are suddenly interested in analyzing and trying to reason out which movements of the different parts could expand the torso and lengthen the spine, reduce the protruding abdomen, and send the head forward and up, then yes, then you need something to describe your intentions. And that something is geometry, clearly. So do I still consider that the Delsarte system is at the root of the teaching of the initial Alexander technique? Yeah, absolutely yes. Never more so. Yeah, and so there is then the notion of correction. There is a notion of passing from the known to the unknown, passing from the right that is wrong to the unknown, wrong that will feel wrong and that is going to be seen as right on video. Yes, outlining geometry is visible on screen. You can tell, you know, we will see later that one of the first, not attempt that one should do, but the first attempt is at, in fact, organizing the torso so that the abdomen is not prominent. The abdomen is not forward. What we want. So you see here two different images of Walter Carrington, the person that was saying that Alexander must have had some contact with the Delsarte system because he showed them a movement of the little finger that the thief would do. And it's quite interesting because they're taken nearly 20 years apart. Yeah. And on one, we will see that the geometry is much more Delsartean, when in the other, the geometry is absolutely not. It's opposite to the Delsartean way of standing. I obviously said earlier that there is no Delsartean way of standing. That is the same for everyone, of course, yes. But the principles are still there. You can note whether a person is using the torso correctly according to the Delsarte system or not. With the Alexander technique, it's very different because it's accepted that these fantastic individuals were so fantastic that they didn't use, they didn't need form. They had poise, I don't know, in their cells. Well, in the Delsarte system, this is not possible to think in that way. And I do not think in that way, by the way. You cannot transmit a clear idea of the movements of the different parts if you are projecting the abdomen forward that way. So there is this idea of correcting oneself, where we see that in the modern Alexander technique, when you are a senior teacher and you're renowned, then correcting yourself is not really the matter. It's not really important because you've got it. Yeah. In the Delsarte system, it's not the way. In the Delsarte system, you understand that there is going to be a need of correcting the different movements that make the coordination resulting in your gestures and your postures. But it's also clear that there is no quick fix in the Delsarte system. And I do not teach this idea that instantly by the touch of a fantastic person, you would be made new. This is not the Delsarte system. And it is not the first attempt that one succeeds in correcting oneself. It's never. Well, that sounds like why would somebody have a lesson if the aim is to correct oneself and that is never going to be there? Well, because there is perfection and we cannot attain it. And so you can have results, but one must put a lot of goodwill and constancy into it without letting oneself be discouraged by the apparent failure of the first efforts. And it is quite clear that I teach constancy. I do not expect constancy from my pupils. I teach constancy to them. I have them make experiments with themselves, creating very complex organizations of movements that are way beyond their actual capacity of thinking together all these things and of translating these ideas into intentions that are going to resist the first impact of performing these actions, because as soon as you perform new intentions of movement, of course, your feeling absolutely will like submerge your conscious mind. You must understand that new coordinations of movement feel atrocious, and we are not used to keeping calm when feeling that way. We have a tendency to lose our reasoning immediately. So it's a necessary trial and lesson to be subjected to these tremendous surge of feelings, sometimes emotions, and learning to reason, learning not to stop reasoning at that moment. So in the initial Alexander technique, there is an absolute truth that the pupil must consider from the start, is that it's not the first attempt that one succeeds in correcting oneself. That does not make sense. Yes? Quick fix, you're going to feel different, it's all going to be nice. That does not exist in the Delsarte system. And so despite the fact that there is no fantastic marketing solution to offer ease, offer redemption, offer equanimity and presence, and all these things that the modern Alexander technique has a tendency to push forward. Well, there are things to learn in the Delsarte system, or in the modern Alexander technique. What is considered as negligible here becomes the reason for having more lessons, investigating. So the gesture is composed of movements and the movement of time. The use of an organism determines its form. I understand that these very short sentences are very difficult to understand. So the first one, the gesture is composed of movement. Yes, I think you have it. Yes, but what do we mean by the movement is made of time? Well, the movement is made of time is that you will see that when a person, for example, is falling against a wall, there is a very old Delsarte procedure that he called the wall exercise that Alexander described as one his main procedure in 1905, for example. Nowadays, it's lost. I mean, in the modern Alexander technique, I don't think any teacher has ever told me learning what is the wall exercise in a training course, a start training course. It doesn't. Nobody knows about it. So when you will see the person falling against the wall, well, it's a safe procedure because the person is standing very close to the wall. There is no danger here. But you can, when watching the video, you can see what is reaching the wall first. So obviously, there is what Delsarte calls a proportion of movement. The person is touching first with the shoulders. So the shoulders are going faster than the middle of the torso where the abdomen is. So we are starting to consider coordination as different movements happening at the same time, but these movements have different speed. A movement of time, the movement is made of time, is a very simple definition of speed. Speed is the amount of space that you cover in a certain time. And that use of the organism determines its form. That's absolutely clear. My pupils are observing themselves performing all sorts of action, and they observe that the use of the different parts and the different movements and the speed of the movement of the parts that they choose to perform determines its form. This is fundamental. It's a fundamental law that makes the lesson concrete. That is the system of idea that we are using are not a philosophy. They are more technique, something concrete that either works or does not. So then the wealth of a gesture is proportional to the number of its agents, each agent revealing a function. Exactly as the more organs in a form, the greater its wealth. The more a gesture brings into play joints, the more its wealth and power. So in the initial Alexander technique I teach, I ask students to bring into play more and more joints into the same activity. I show very clearly that when the person is falling against the wall or sitting or bringing their hands forward to rest on the chair, they have a tendency to stifle, limit, resist some movements. And so the game is to free the movements. And to free the movements, the person has to discover that first there is a resistance against this movement. This resistance is subconscious, and by that we mean that the person feels wrong or feels tense or feel a stretch, a strain, feel something in producing opposite movements. Is that bad? Well, for most people, when they start to feel some sort of strain or even close to pain, for them it indicates, that feeling indicates that it's bad, that it's wrong, that you should never do that, you should stay relaxed. Well, this is absolutely not the way of the Delsarte system. The way of the Delsarte system is to reason out and see that if the new direction of movement has a tendency to stretch and expand the torso, even if you feel something wrong, something bad about it, that has no value, no weight. Feeling in the Delsarte system have very, very little weight. Do what your body is telling you. In the Delsarte system, the body is not talking to you. You may be impersonating your body, saying, I feel bad, so it must be bad. But the Delsarte system totally rejects that view. It's the Delsarte system has a technical way of thinking. For example, when you say every movement is proportional to the mass moved, so that the big agent moves slowly and the small ones move fast. Well, it's quite interesting to watch a person taking a step, because you will have a tendency to imagine that, well, if you want to maintain a dynamic organization of parts, which is associated with lengthening, with length, so the form of the structure must be lengthening. There is a very basic idea here that the stature has to lengthen. If you take a step and you discover that taking a step you shorten the stature, it's quite interesting to look at the different movements. And it's very obvious that the person has a tendency to move the fast parts easily and great difficulty in moving the big agents. The biggest agent, of course, in the anatomical structure being the torso. It's all centered about the torso, the Delsarte system. Despite the fact that you may have seen people making movement with the face and saying this is the Delsarte system. Of course, in the Delsarte system, there is a notion of the movement of the different parts of the face that you can consciously direct. But this is hiding the big truth that the gestural harmony cannot be a gestural harmony of the face movements, of course. And so each joint of the whole produces a particular rhythm in the gestural harmony and necessitate a special study in this perspective. That again is very important to understand. What do we mean by a special study? A special study does not mean that somebody else is going to make your joints move and you must study, feel how it is when the joint is moved by someone else. How what you feel when the joint is moved by someone else correspond to anything you would feel when you coordinate the movement of that joint plus 7 others. Nothing. So in the Delsarte, studying has a totally different meaning. It's a study that is made along a principle of experiments, where you create several intentions, a series of intentions of movements of different parts that are clearly delineated, that are clearly defined and by words. And you think, I am going to perform in front of a set of mirrors. For us, it's in front of a video recording system, and I'm going to direct these movements in opposite directions. And study means that you want to see whether you've obeyed your intentions or not in practice. That's all. When you are, the definition is to consciously control the movements. Consciously control that you can translate theories, orders, mental directions of movement into practice. The form should attest that you can or not. That's what we mean by study. It's a real form of study. So let's take one. Russell again, 1890. The first thing to be acquired, preparatory to all further effort, is the knack of lifting the chest into its proper position by the action of the waist and intercostal muscles and holding it as a prominent part of the body, a post of honor too often usurped by the inferior abdomen. The first idea, when you were learning the Delsarte system, preparatory to all further work, is the knack. The knack is something you control, something you can understand, and therefore perform in front of an audience. Perform on stage, or perform in front of a camera if you want. Yeah. So lifting the chest into its proper position by the action of the waist and intercostal muscles and holding it as the prominent part of the body. Well, in the modern Alexander technique, no. In Alexander's writing, the description of wrong use is clearly shown here. We have here a new student. Well, she's a very interesting lady. She had lessons with Margaret Goldie, an enormous number of lessons with Margaret Goldie in the 60s. And she found through Penelope, I think, that I was giving lessons that were close to Margaret Goldie's, which they are absolutely not. My lessons are totally different, but she wanted to have lessons with me. And so she's, this is, I think, our second or third lesson, no more. And so, as you can see, she's standing very, very close to a wall. In the wall exercise, as described by Alexander, not by Delsarte, but by Alexander, the student is to stand at 6 inches away from the wall. He gives two possibilities, 6 inches or 12 inches. So this is very close to the 6 inches, but it's not. I do not ask my student to stand at 6 inches of the wall. I ask my student to stand at a fist distance from the wall, and they have to measure their own fist. The fist seen from above, from the side of the little finger to the side of the thumb, and it's more often than not much smaller than 6 inches. 6 inches is too much. Most people, the fear reflex, the fear response to equilibrium is so strong that I cannot have my student stand so far away. So this person is standing at a fist distance from the wall. And so I asked her, when you're standing, what part of yourself is the most forward? And so I had to explain what I explained by this. I said, apart from the toes, if you imagine you were looking at yourself from the side, yeah? And there is, for example, a wall in front of you, so that we can ascertain the distance between different parts and the wall in front of you. What do you think is the part that is the most forwards? There was no question. And this lady knows what she means, you know, and she said, well, I would say it's the head. Her impression, her personal perception of her gesture is that she has the head forward of the abdomen. Well, that's what our friend Russell is discussing. The first thing to be acquired preparatory to all further effort is the knack of lifting the chest into its proper position by the action of the waist and intercostal muscle and holding it as the prominent part of the body. You must excuse Russell, it's a poor translation from the French. Prominent means the most forward part. And what we see is that this person is, not realizing what has been her gesture and the resulting posture for so many years. She is standing with the head back and the abdomen forward. And so the first thing I need to teach her as a good Delsartean initial Alexander technique teacher is to stop doing this, to stop having a problem. Alexander used a different expression to describe the same system. He says we have here an unduly lifted front part of the chest, protruding shoulder blades, protruding abdomen, shortened back, yes, and the limbs and trunk are not affected and aided by the force of gravity. Of course, as you can see, the abdomen is very much forward of the ankle, which is the fulcrum, and of course the upper torso is compensating. So if you do teach the initial Alexander technique, or if you take a lesson of the initial Alexander technique, very often the first thing, as Russell is discussing here, is to change the chest position. The chest is part of the torso. Just after that, we are discussing the means. And listen to this. The same motion which throws out the chest should draw in the lower part of the trunk, having it from the curve of the spine instead of resting it clumsily in the pelvis like a great pudding in a basin. You need to stand with me because this is a bit intricate. Of course, the motion here is the motion of the abdomen and the motion of the chest. What Russell is suggesting, if you read with great attention, is that the same movement that is protruding the abdomen is pushing the shoulders back and pushing the lower sacrum back. What he proposes is the solution. As he say, the same motion which throws out the chest, which brings the chest, the upper part of the torso, forward, and not the abdomen, should draw in the lower part of the trunk. And so, to understand this hanging it from the curve of the spine, instead of resting clumsily in the pelvis like a great pudding in a basin, in fact, that's why I've taken these two pictures. Because this is the rotation of the rib cage. We see that the upper rib cage is coming forward, lower rib cage is going back. Well, unfortunately, the coordination of the movement of the neck is not met by the coordination of the head, and so he's pulling down with the chin onto his chest. So this is unfortunate. But for the part, we see that the chest is not hanging like a pudding. So when the chest is hanging and the abdomen is hanging like a pudding, it's the shape you have on this picture. Yeah, we want to learn to organize the movement of the chest and pelvis so that the pelvis is starting to be moved back and the lower sacrum forward, so that suddenly you're going to hang from the spine. And so this is this instruction, understanding that you can start to analyze the lengthening of the spine as the result of the rotation of the different agents. One is the rib cage, the other one is the pelvis, as both are in fact linked rigidly with the spine. It's obvious that if you create the rotation of the rib cage and the spine, instead of resting it clumsily, well, you are going to lengthen the spine. And so this is exactly what I teach in the proper attitude for good breathing. The hips turn slightly inward, so you will understand that is not very accurate in the direction. And the chin goes back but not up. The shoulder being left absolutely out of consideration. And he adds, throwing them back or attempting forcibly to straighten them result in half a dozen evils, more to be dreaded than round shoulders. If you're familiar with Alexander's writing, you will find very often uncanny resemblance between the choice of words in the old Delsartean books and in Alexander's, the evils are present in Alexander's books in 3 different parts. And Russell is saying is that take care of the chest and the shoulders will take care of themselves. Very, very dangerous statement indeed. So when the student is starting to have lessons, what we see is that, yes, there is a tendency when the person is falling backward to have a coordination of movement where the speed of the shoulder is greater. By the way, this is already a new effort. This is a new effort. I will explain. When the pupil starts, we will see that there is a big gap that can be measured between the wall and the center of the lumbar spine. The person is out. You are arching the chest when the top of the torso is moving in opposite direction to the middle torso. Yeah, and so I've already requested that person to create a link. I said to that person, you're leaning against the wall. Yes, your buttocks have touched first. I want you to go away from the wall. And when the person is going away from the wall, this is the coordination of movement that we see. See, the person tries to go away from the wall. And to go away from the wall, the person is doing exactly the same coordination of movement that she did in order to fall against the wall. She's getting the knees and middle abdomen to accelerate forward while the upper chest and lower pelvis are decelerating backward. It's surprising. The same coordination of movement is used to, in fact, create the fall as to go away from the wall. And so when the person starts to see this, it's possible to reason out that she could direct the movement in opposite direction. She could direct the middle torso back. Let the back go back and the upper torso come forward. And when the upper torso come forward, instead of having the hips going forward, she will try and get the hips going back by pushing the lower sacrum forward. And so the person will then start to change her organization of movement, and it's very easy to show her that suddenly she can organize the back differently. We see on this picture that she has totally reversed the movement. The lower sacrum is directed forward, but the knees are really pushed back so that she's not going from the wall, and she is leaning forward with the back lengthening, yes, and the upper torso coming forward, so that now, at last, she's discovering what we mean by proeminent, by having the head forward of the abdomen. Having the head forward of the abdomen? This is a Delsarte idea. Yeah, this is the way to, in fact, lengthen the spine and open the airways, as described by Delsarte. So, of course, I understand that I had to interpret every sentence of the Delsartean author and of Delsarte themselves, because there is nothing clear-cut, there is nothing spelled out word for word. We don't know what were the Delsarte orders of movements. Yeah, some people say we are not even sure that there were Delsarte orders of movements. Well, I had to certainly create a grammar of orders of movements for the person to very quickly experience what we mean by lengthening the back and opening the airways. So for me, this does not matter. Yeah, if they cannot read what I read in Delsarte, well, I don't care. But this, of course, is not the modern Alexander technique. This is very reminiscent of Alexander and the first generation teacher. But when the first generation teachers started to evolve their technique, remember the evolution between the young Walter and elderly Walter. Suddenly, no matter what you want to say about the kindness and the greatness of the man, it's sure that his use of the different movements of the parts of the self have completely, gone too wrong. And also, very recently, I saw a few pictures of some teachers, because there is one thing is to not be capable after many years to continue the work and continue to re-educate oneself, so that we are seen to be protruding the abdomen and arching the spine. But it's another thing to look at the directions of movement that touch teacher are impregnating the student with. Their understanding of the coordination of movement is totally different. These are photographs from 1971, and it's Marjorie Barstow. She's a teacher of the modern Alexander technique, and she's organizing the parts for the pupil. It's very strange, but we see the protruding abdomen, the unduly lifting of a part of the chest, and the shortened back. She's supposed to feel with her hands what is right. Apparently, what is right does not correspond to Alexander's own idea. And when you see her working with a student, I don't know who the student is. That's why I put a mask on him, so that this is Marjorie Barstow. She's not going to complain. And what I see is that the retraction on the upper torso. You must understand something. The spine is the support of the chest. Yes, but the spine goes, of course, above the chest. So there is a part of the spine that is above the chest. But if you rotate the chest in such a way that the top of the sternum is completely far back, what will happen is that the rib cage is going to retract the upper thoracic spine very far back. Well, if the upper thoracic spine is retracted very far back, there is no point. The head is, miles backward relatively to the abdomen. The person is retracting the neck and retracting the head, and no matter what she says, she's really shortening the stature. I don't care. But what is strange is that she's imparting exactly the same organization on her pupil. And it's not a one-time action. There are many pictures where you see these renowned Alexander teachers of the modern Alexander technique being, presenting a coordination of movement that has nothing to do with opening the airways and expanding the chest. So, Alexander said, it is evident that the misuse must be diagnosed by the instructor, and he may be called upon to use considerable ingenuity and patience in correcting the faults and substituting the correct mental orders for the one general order which stopped the whole train of vicious habitual movement. I don't think he was discussing the order to think up, or the order to lengthen the spine. Or maybe he was, I don't know. So, to conclude this, what I want to say is that yes, I'm still thinking that the Delsarte system can teach us a lot of things. Well, of course, not scholarly, not like following the words and the dots. You have to understand, and when you're told that there is a grammar of movements, and you cannot find the grammar of movements, you have to try and construct your own grammar of movements. That's what I have tried to perform. Any question?
I just want to say for people watching the video, if you haven't listened to them, that Jeando did a series of podcast interviews with Robert Rickover a few years ago that you can find online, where you talk about Delsarte and you're discovering this. talk about more about the history of it. We have an episode of this, I think it's episode number 2, on the history of conscious guidance and control, which goes into some of this also as well. So people might want to look at those along with this. So the question, it begs the question then, if Alexander was following on from the Delsarte system so much, as you argue, and there's even an advert where he's advertising that he teaches the Delsarte system, it's like in black and white in 1900s. Why was he not more clear about the relationship between these? Why does he not talk about it later? And also connected with this, why the change to the hands instead of not using hands? Why is he not revealed his sources more?
It's very difficult to say. It's well, first of all, he was making a living, and he certainly was afraid of not making a living, and maybe he's. That's all conjecture. I don't really know. Sometimes I'm very surprised, and sometimes I'm very surprised that he did not explore a bit more what I call the grammar of gestures himself. We heard that he was dissatisfied with his students not being capable of translating the instructions, the orders, into performance, and that he started to explain with his hands. But you don't explain with hands. There is not an explanation. I can't understand that he did not see that by manipulating the people, he was making them feel the effect of the desired movements. And effects of movements have nothing to do with means of directing movement. He was telling people to, in fact, use their sensory appreciation. So after that, they started to believe that their sensory appreciation had been re-educated, so it was fine to use it. Well, I wanted to show the few pictures of the senior, very renowned teacher to show that there is no question that their sensory system were totally wrong. They could not analyze and understand the movement they were doing with the different parts of the torso to lengthen. And so this idea that these teachers have a direct contact with nature and what is right, and they, by feeling, can reorganize a person, this is marketing for me.
And none of them, and it's just as simple to see, just look at pictures, none of them look like Alexander did.
No.
Especially like right from the beginning, how he looked. They just don't have the same visible structure at all.
Absolutely not.
They all have a protruding abdomen. Everyone
Yeah.
who's been through the training has a protruding abdomen, which Alexander says is a defect, and which he didn't have. So it's amazing.
Yeah, it's very strange. And also what is very strange, he never tried to make his student analyze. It's one thing to say you should analyze, because he repeats you should analyze. Yes, fine, but what do you mean? How? What are the tools that you are going to give us to start analyzing something? You can start to analyze when you start to observe a segment and you think, look, the segment is rotating around a point of motion. The point of motion is here. The directive force is there. These are Delsarte's words I'm using here. And of course, the point of application of that force is on that structure. So when you are accelerating the knee forward, what do you think is the hip doing? Is the hip accelerating faster or less? And the person will look at the video and say, well, the hip is much slower. That's it. We start to analyze. So when the knee is fast and the hip is much slower, does this project the upper torso to be prominent, or is it the abdomen that is prominent? And the person says, I don't know. I say, it's not for you to know. It's for you to analyze and look. So let's go and look at the video once more and see what happens when the knee is fast, when the hip are very slow. What happens with the abdomen? Oh yeah, it's protruding. That's the start of analysis. So you discover that protruding the abdomen is not a defect that is separate from the others. It's a certain kind of organization of movements that leads to a certain form. And so when you start to reason in that way, it becomes quite easy to think, what if I was directing the movement of the knee and of the hip and of the rib cage at the same time? you start conscious guidance. When you start conscious guidance in this way, the first thing you're met with is how stretched you feel, how immensely pull you encounter yourself. The antagonistic pulls are not something you try to dream on into real life. No, it's it's a very real confrontation. We do not invent antagonistic pulls. The antagonistic pulls are just a mechanical result of directions of movements. And so Alexander did not use antagonistic pull after 1908. It was all there in the elastic resistance in the Delsarte system that they all tried to implement by changing the directions of the movements. Why Alexander abandoned all this in favor of being a guru, being a guy that could make it for you? It's very, very difficult to understand. Very, very difficult.
Another link between the Delsarte system and Alexander technique is the idea of control. So like in modern Alexander, the idea seems to be that everyone wants to just give it up. You just don't do these. You like stop and inhibit this few things, and then everything, the right thing will just do itself. It's like you're giving up responsibility. You want it done for you by nature or universal mind or whatever metaphor they use. Whereas in Delsarte, it's about using your mind to control the movements, using your body as an instrument. In Alexander's book, Constructive Conscious Control, he's talking about control. To control something, you're having to monitor and make adjustments to the movements. It's not something that just happens on its own. It wouldn't be, that's not conscious control. You're being subconsciously controlled, which is what he was talking about.
It came through this idea of primary control. There is a special button that you can activate, and it's going to transform your gestures. It's like
the idea is maybe they're not totally aware of this, but the assumption is, the feeling they probably have is that it's going to control it for them. The magic primary control button, just the head neck connection, if I just get that free or whatever, it will control all the movements for you. It's just complete opposite of what Delsarte's saying. It's complete opposite of what Alexander's saying, especially in the early books. It's very clear. This is what he's talking about, using reason instead of feeling.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like the early Alexander technique and the later Alexander technique are the same thing at all.
Well, it depends, because you will find notions of conscious control also in the fourth books when Alexander is reviewing his life. But I don't know. It's more a question of psychology. Why would the guy try to make a guru out of himself like this and suffer the cost? And the cost is not suffered only by him, by all his students that really didn't make it, didn't understand what it was about. And I think it's good to have some, historical basis, or textual basis is better, because there is no historical basis, but textual basis that we can explore and therefore come back much closer to this idea of conscious guidance and control. And that's what I've always tried to implement. This is my point. I do continue with the idea that we are pursuing that transmission of the Delsarte heritage.
One last parallel between the two men is that Delsarte's, you've talked about this before, is the Delsarte's followers changed quite a bit of what he was doing in the early days also. So the people that came after him are not talking necessarily about the same system in the same way as the people who came after Alexander are not necessarily talking about the same system. And maybe it's just people are looking for the easy thing, not the thing that not the thing they fail on the first attempts or that never get perfect. They want the thing that has the quick fix. So that it might just be a human condition rather than anything to do with Alexander or Delsarte. So anyway, for people watching, if you want to book a lesson with Jeando and experience what it is we're talking about, you'll find a link to his Facebook and his email and his website underneath. And we'll see you in the next video. So thank you, Jeando.